She lies on the hospital bed, writhing in unbearable pain, pleading for help. But the cold-hearted nurse only looks at her with disdain, refusing to lift a finger. Will she endure this cruelty? Watch till the end to see what happens next. Subscribe for more powerful stories, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Camille clutched her stomach, gasping as another wave of pain surged through her. She had barely made it to the hospital doors, her body racked with the intense labor pains that had struck hours earlier. The waiting room was filled with the distant sounds of hospital activity, bustling medical staff, and faint announcements over the intercom. But, as she was brought in, all those sounds seemed to fade away, leaving only the echo of her breathing and the deep ache that pulsed through her. A nurse guided her to a bed in a sterile room, murmuring a quick, "Someone will be with you soon," before stepping out without a second glance. Camille lay there, the cold sheets underneath her a sharp contrast to the heat radiating from her body. She knew the pain was a sign her baby was close, yet no one seemed in any hurry to help her. She reached out, pressing the call button in hopes of speeding things up. Minutes ticked by, and still no one arrived. Each contraction felt like a mountain crushing her, pressing her deeper into the mattress. The silence was maddening, and each minute that passed heightened her anxiety. She looked around, trying to focus on anything that might distract her from the relentless pain. But the room was bare, devoid of anything comforting, just walls painted in a cold, clinical white, and the faint buzz of a fluorescent light above. A door creaked open, and Camille's heart leapt with hope. Finally, she thought, relief would come, the process would begin, and she would have the support she needed to bring her baby into the world. But when the doctor entered, she immediately sensed something was wrong. His face was unreadable, almost indifferent, as he flipped through a clipboard without looking at her. "How are we feeling?" he asked, his tone flat, as if her pain were an inconvenience he was forced to address. Camille swallowed, her throat dry. I'm in a lot of pain," she managed, her voice a strained whisper. The doctor glanced at her briefly before focusing back on his notes. "It's normal," he said curtly, without a hint of compassion. He scribbled something down and turned, already making his way to the door. "But the baby," Camille tried to continue, her voice laced with desperation, but he had already left the room, leaving her alone once again. Her hands clenched around the sheets as another contraction tore through her body. She pressed the call button again, her mind racing with questions. Why weren't they helping her? Wasn't she in the right place, surrounded by professionals who were supposed to support her? She forced herself to breathe, to hold back the panic that clawed at her chest, but with every passing moment, her sense of dread only grew stronger. Several more minutes dragged by before another nurse entered. She was young, her face marked by a slight frown of impatience, and she avoided looking directly at Camille. She moved to the other side of the room, adjusting equipment and checking charts without saying a word. "Please," Camille whispered, reaching out, her hand trembling with pain and fear. Can you check on the baby? I think he's coming soon." The nurse barely glanced in her direction, her expression dismissive. "You're fine," she muttered under her breath, barely audible, as though Camille were a nuisance rather than a patient. "If it's your first, it can take hours." Camille's heart sank. The woman's coldness cut through her, as painful as the contractions that racked her body. She wanted to protest, to demand the care she needed, but her voice felt trapped in her throat. With each word left unsaid, she felt smaller, like she was disappearing into the hospital bed, just another patient ignored and dismissed. Another wave of pain hit her, sharper and stronger than before. She whimpered, clutching her stomach, tears forming in her eyes as she felt herself losing control. Her body was screaming for help, but there was no one to answer. Time blurred as she lay there, each second stretching into eternity. Her vision wavered, a mix of exhaustion and agony overwhelming her senses. She gritted her teeth, trying to focus on breathing, willing herself to stay strong, but it was getting harder. Every minute without care, without compassion, wore her down a little more. 2 more nurses passed by her room, their footsteps echoing down the hall. One of them glanced inside, meeting Camille's pleading gaze, but her expression remained impassive as she whispered something to her colleague and continued down the corridor. Camille felt a flash of anger, a spark of indignation, but it was quickly smothered by another wave of pain that left her gasping for breath. At one point, the young nurse returned, adjusting her IV with the same mechanical, indifferent precision. Camille gathered her strength, attempting once more to plead for help. "Please, it's getting worse," she murmured, her voice breaking. The nurse looked at her, a slight sneer curling her lips. "People like you always think you need more than anyone else," she muttered under her breath, the words stinging like a slap. Without another word, she turned and left, leaving Camille reeling from both the pain in her body and the bitterness of those words. "People like me?" Camille whispered, her mind racing. She felt a surge of anger, a desire to stand up for herself, but her body betrayed her. She was too weak, too exhausted to fight back, trapped in a state of helplessness. The door clicked shut again, and Camille was left in silence, her breaths ragged, her body trembling with the strain. She closed her eyes, feeling the sting of tears that she could no longer hold back. She had never felt so alone, so vulnerable. In this place where she should have found comfort, where she should have felt safe, she was met with nothing but contempt and neglect. The pain continued to build, her contractions coming faster, more intense, and with each one, her hope dwindled. She gripped the sheets, her knuckles white, her mind a haze of pain and despair. There was no one to help her, no one who cared. She was lost, adrift in a sea of suffering, and all she could do was endure. As the hours dragged on, Camille clung to a small glimmer of hope. She thought of her husband, Samuel. Surely he would come. He had to. Camille lay on the hospital bed, her body tense and aching, each contraction bringing sharper waves of pain. The hours crawled by, yet her condition had barely been acknowledged. Every muscle in her body was taut, straining under the relentless, intensifying pain that signaled her baby's arrival was near. Her throat was hoarse from groaning, her hands clenched around the bed rails, but no one came to her aid. She felt abandoned, trapped in a place that should have provided her relief. Between contractions, her mind reeled. This wasn't how she'd imagined her child's birth. She'd envisioned a supportive environment, medical staff surrounding her with kindness and care. But reality had shattered those illusions, leaving her with the cold, hollow truth. Her pleas had gone unanswered, and the few times someone did approach her, they barely acknowledged her pain. Footsteps echoed outside her room. Camille's heart leapt at the sound. A faint hope rekindled that someone, anyone, might finally show compassion. She looked towards the door, expecting a doctor or nurse with reassurance and medical support. But when it opened, the young nurse from before entered with an exasperated look, holding a chart and muttering to herself. Without looking at Camille, she glanced at the monitor beside the bed, scribbled something, then turned to leave. "Please." Camille's voice was barely above a whisper, weak from hours of agony and helplessness. She tried to sit up, but the weight of her pain kept her anchored. "I need help." The nurse halted, turned slightly, and cast Camille a dismissive glance. "You're still at it, huh?" she muttered with a scornful smile. "You've been managing fine so far, haven't you?" I don't think I can keep waiting." "The baby?" Camille's voice cracked, and she clutched her stomach as another contraction seized her body harder and fiercer than the last. The nurse sighed, her expression hardening. "First pregnancies can take a while. It's normal for labor to be drawn out." She checked her watch with a hint of annoyance. "You're not the only patient here, you know." Camille's eyes filled with tears, the ache of loneliness sinking deep within her. She was more than a patient. She was a mother about to bring her child into the world, a human being deserving of kindness and care. But here, she was treated as though she were a burden. Each time her gaze met the nurse's indifferent eyes, Camille felt her spirit diminish a little more. Her words, however faint, went unheeded, falling like dead leaves against the cold floor. The nurse left the room, her footsteps receding into the corridor, leaving Camille in deafening silence. As the minutes passed, the pain grew more intense, reaching levels she hadn't thought possible. Her hands clawed at the sheets, her body twisting involuntarily with each surge of agony. She pressed the call button repeatedly, her fingers fumbling with the small remote. But no one came, and with each second that dragged on, her hope waned further. She thought about her husband, Samuel, her mind reaching for his comforting presence, his strong arms holding her, giving her the support she needed. She had tried to contact him, but her calls had gone unanswered, and the isolation weighed heavily on her. A fresh wave of pain struck, ripping her from her thoughts and leaving her gasping. The door opened again, and Camille looked up, her vision blurred with tears, hoping against hope that this time someone would help. But it was another nurse she hadn't seen before, her face blank as she took in Camille's exhausted form. "Please," Camille whimpered, barely able to speak. I need help. Something's wrong." The nurse rolled her eyes. "People always think their labor is the hardest," she said, her tone clipped. "You're just like everyone else, really. Nothing special." Camille's heart broke at the nurse's words. She wasn't asking for special treatment, only basic care, a bit of compassion. Each word felt like a wound, cutting deeper, making her feel smaller, less worthy of the care she so desperately needed. She clutched her stomach, feeling the pain spread, consuming her entire being. Her mind drifted back to her past, moments when she had faced prejudice and injustice. But nothing had ever felt as raw and as brutal as this. Here, at her most vulnerable, the very people sworn to protect her were treating her with disdain. She was drowning in a sea of indifference, her voice drowned out by the cold silence of the sterile room. For hours she endured the neglect, alone and unheard. Her strength waned with each contraction, the relentless pain draining her of any remaining energy. She closed her eyes, pressing her lips together, willing herself to stay strong for her child. But her body was betraying her. She felt the darkness creeping in, threatening to pull her under. Another doctor entered, and Camille's eyes fluttered open, her vision cloudy. She tried to speak, but her voice was a faint whisper. The doctor barely looked at her as he checked her chart, muttering something under his breath. Is the baby okay?" Camille managed, her voice trembling with exhaustion. The doctor glanced at her with a look of mild irritation. "The baby will come when it's ready," he replied dismissively, scribbling on her chart before turning away. "Labor takes time." As he left, Camille felt her heart sink deeper. She wanted to scream, to shout, but her body was too weak, her spirit too crushed. She lay there, tears slipping down her cheeks, feeling as if she were disappearing with each passing minute. She clung to her resolve, holding on to the hope that someone, somehow, would come to her aid. But even that hope was fading. Hours later, another contraction ripped through her body, leaving her breathless, her muscles spasming with the strain. Her hands tightened around the sheets, her knuckles white, as she fought to keep herself from crying out. The fear of more indifference, more cruelty, kept her silent. She couldn't bear another dismissive look, another cutting remark. The pain became her only company, an unrelenting force that consumed her. She could feel herself slipping, the exhaustion seeping into her bones, weighing her down. Her mind drifted back to Samuel, her only source of comfort. She imagined him beside her, his hand holding hers, his voice steady and calming. But it was only a memory, a faint glimmer of solace in an ocean of suffering. Camille's body shuddered, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She was trapped in a cycle of pain and neglect, each moment blending into the next. The loneliness pressed down on her like a heavy blanket, suffocating her, leaving her feeling hollow and forgotten. She pressed the call button one last time, but no one came. As the night wore on, Camille lay in silence, her body racked with pain, her mind clouded with despair. She had reached the end of her strength, her spirit frayed and broken. All she could do was endure, to survive one moment at a time, clinging to the fragile hope that soon, somehow, this nightmare would end. Camille lay motionless on the hospital bed, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Every muscle in her body ached, her skin was clammy, and her head spun from exhaustion and pain. The contractions came more frequently now, a relentless force that felt like it was tearing her apart from the inside. Her body was ready to give birth, but she was trapped in a world of inaction, cruelty, and neglect. The thought of her baby being so close but still unreachable made her heart ache with an intensity that matched the pain of labor. She pressed the call button one more time, her thumb trembling as it hovered over the small button. The small beep echoed through the room, but Camille didn't expect anyone to come. It had been hours since she had first been admitted, and every cry for help had either been ignored or answered with disdain. She had no strength left to fight, no energy to demand better treatment. She had been reduced to a silent figure writhing in pain, waiting for someone to care enough to intervene. As her vision blurred, she thought of Samuel again, wishing he were there. He had promised he would make it in time for the birth. He had been out of town on urgent business, but Camille knew that if he had any idea what was happening, he would be by her side, protecting her. He would never allow this to happen. The door creaked open, and Camille flinched, expecting to see the same uncaring nurse or doctor come in to throw another dismissive glance in her direction. But when she heard the familiar, steady footsteps and caught sight of a tall figure in the doorway, her heart leapt with both relief and disbelief. It was Samuel. He stepped into the room, his face filled with concern as his eyes locked on Camille. In an instant, he was at her side, kneeling beside the bed and taking her hand in his. His fingers were warm, a stark contrast to her cold, clammy skin. "Camille," he breathed, his voice a mixture of love and fear. "I'm here. I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner." Camille looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes, but she was too weak to speak. All she could do was grip his hand as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. The pain in her body was overwhelming, but seeing him brought a flicker of hope that had been absent for so long. "What's going on?" Samuel asked, his eyes scanning her face, searching for answers. He could see the pain etched in every line, the exhaustion that had drained the color from her cheeks. "Why haven't they started the delivery yet?" Camille opened her mouth to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. All she could do was shake her head, her chest tightening with a mixture of frustration and helplessness. Samuel stood up, his concern deepening as he turned toward the door, his hand still holding hers. "I'm going to get someone," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "I'll get this sorted out." Before he could take a step, the door opened once more, and a doctor entered. It was the same man who had glanced at Camille earlier without much thought, the one who had dismissed her pain as normal. He barely looked at Samuel as he shuffled through a stack of papers on his clipboard. "We're just waiting," the doctor said casually, not bothering to acknowledge Camille's suffering. "She's progressing, but it'll take time. First pregnancies often do." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Take time?" His voice was low, but there was a hard edge to it. "My wife has been here for hours, and from what I can see, no one has bothered to even check on her properly." The doctor shrugged, still not making eye contact. "It's not unusual. We have other patients, and there's no need for unnecessary interventions." Samuel's grip on Camille's hand tightened as he turned toward the doctor, his eyes narrowing. "Unnecessary interventions? She's in agony. Have you even looked at her? Have you seen the state she's in?" The doctor finally glanced up, but his expression remained indifferent. "She's in labor. Labor hurts. We've given her pain relief. What more do you want?" Samuel took a deep breath, trying to steady his rising anger. "I want her to be treated like a human being, not like some inconvenience you're trying to brush off." His voice was shaking with barely contained fury. The doctor sighed, clearly annoyed by Samuel's tone. "Look, I understand you're upset, but this is how it goes sometimes. We can't rush things just because—" "Because what?" Samuel interrupted, his voice rising. "Because she's black." The words hung in the air, thick with accusation. The doctor's face hardened, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he looked down at his clipboard and muttered, "I'll send someone in to check on her in a bit." "In a bit?" Samuel's voice was sharp now, cutting through the sterile atmosphere of the room. "You'll send someone now, right now." The doctor paused, glancing at Samuel for the first time with a hint of recognition, as if only now realizing he might be speaking to someone more important than he initially thought. He nodded once, curtly, and left the room without another word. Samuel turned back to Camille, kneeling beside her again, his hand brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice heavy with guilt. "I should have been here sooner. I had no idea this was happening." Camille managed a faint smile, though her face was etched with pain. "You're here now," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's all that matters." Samuel sat beside her, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm not leaving your side again," he promised, his voice low and fierce. I'll make sure they take care of you." The door opened once more, and this time a nurse hurried in, looking flustered. She glanced nervously at Samuel, then at Camille, before moving to check the monitors. "I'll see how far along she is," the nurse murmured, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the equipment. Samuel stood up, his presence commanding, making the nurse work faster. As she moved about the room, Samuel watched her closely, his expression unreadable but firm. He wasn't just a concerned husband anymore. He was the man who owned this hospital, and the staff were finally starting to realize it. "Make sure you're doing everything necessary," Samuel said, his tone sharp. "My wife's been in labor for hours without proper care. That ends now." The nurse nodded quickly, her face pale as she hurried to follow Samuel's instructions. She avoided making eye contact with him as she moved about the room, her fingers fumbling with the charts and machines. As the nurse worked, Samuel turned back to Camille, gently stroking her hair. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, his voice filled with love and determination. "I'll make sure of it." For the first time in hours, Camille felt a small glimmer of hope. Samuel was here, and with him came the promise of safety, of justice. She had been through hell, but she wasn't alone anymore. But even as she clung to Samuel's hand, she could feel the weight of what had happened settling heavily on her chest. The cruel words, the neglect, the pain, none of it could be undone. And though Samuel had arrived, she couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare wasn't over yet. As the nurse finished her work and left the room, Samuel sat beside Camille, his hand never leaving hers. The hospital staff were finally beginning to realize who he was, but that didn't erase the damage they had done. Camille had suffered because of their racism and negligence, and Samuel knew it wasn't enough to just get her the care she needed now. He had to hold them accountable for what they had done. "They'll pay for this," Samuel whispered, his voice low and firm. "Every single one of them." Camille nodded weakly, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but in her heart she knew he was right. This was far from over. Samuel would make sure of that. The hospital conference room felt oppressively quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Samuel stood near the head of the long, polished table, his expression steely and unyielding. His presence dominated the room, a mixture of controlled fury and unwavering authority. His gaze, cold and piercing, swept over the small group of doctors and nurses seated before him, all of whom were visibly uncomfortable under his scrutiny. Samuel had summoned them here, those responsible for the neglect and mistreatment of his wife, Camille. Each one of them had failed her in some way. The nurses who ignored her pain, the doctors who dismissed her suffering. None of them had shown her the care and respect she deserved, and now they were about to face the consequences. Camille was resting now, finally receiving the attention she should have had from the start. But Samuel couldn't rest. Not yet. The image of her lying in that hospital bed, pale and broken from hours of untreated pain, was burned into his mind. He had witnessed their cruelty firsthand, and it was time to make things right. The lead doctor, a middle-aged man with a graying beard, cleared his throat nervously and shifted in his seat. His white coat, once a symbol of authority and trust, now seemed like a thin shield against the wrath that Samuel was about to unleash. "Dr. Jameson," the doctor began cautiously, "I understand you're upset, but perhaps we can discuss." "Upset?" Samuel's voice cut through the room like a blade. His tone was low, but carried a weight that silenced the doctor instantly. Upset doesn't even begin to describe what I am. He stepped closer to the table, his eyes locked on the doctor's. My wife came into this hospital in labor. She was in agony, and instead of receiving the care she needed, she was ignored, dismissed, and treated with nothing but contempt. One of the nurses shifted uncomfortably, casting a glance at her colleagues, but no one spoke. Samuel continued, his voice rising with each word, the anger he had held back for Camille's sake now fully unleashed. Not only did you fail to do your jobs, you allowed your own racist biases to dictate how you treated her. You let her suffer because she's black. The room went silent. No one dared to look Samuel in the eye. The tension was palpable, thickening the air until it was almost suffocating. One of the younger nurses, the one who had been dismissive and sneering throughout Camille's ordeal, finally found her voice. Dr. Jameson, I didn't know she was your wife, she stammered, her face pale. If I had known. Samuel's eyes flashed with fury. It shouldn't matter whether she was my wife or a stranger on the street. You are supposed to treat every patient with dignity and care. That's your job, and you failed. The nurse shrank back in her seat, her face flushing with embarrassment. Samuel's gaze moved over to the lead doctor again. You've been practicing medicine for how long, Dr. Abbott? Samuel asked, his voice dangerously calm. 25 years, Dr. Abbott replied, his voice wavering. 25 years, Samuel repeated, shaking his head. And in all that time, did you learn nothing about empathy? About treating your patients with respect? My wife told you she was in pain, and you brushed her off as though she was exaggerating. Do you have any idea what kind of damage you could have caused? Dr. Abbott swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table in front of him. Dr. Jameson, I misjudged the situation. I didn't realize the extent of her discomfort. Misjudged? Samuel's voice was like thunder now. You didn't misjudge anything. You didn't care enough to listen. You saw a black woman, and you assumed her pain wasn't real. That's not misjudgment. That's negligence. A heavy silence followed his words, the weight of the truth sinking in. Each doctor and nurse in the room knew they had failed, and now there was no escape from the consequences. Samuel took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had to remain composed, though every fiber of his being wanted to unleash more of the rage that had been building inside him for hours. There will be consequences for every one of you, Samuel said, his voice cold and resolute. You are all being placed on immediate leave while an investigation is conducted. Depending on the findings, disciplinary action will follow, up to and including termination. Gas rippled through the room, but no one dared to speak against him. They knew they had crossed a line, and Samuel wasn't going to let them get away with it. But know this, Samuel continued, his gaze hardening. Even if some of you manage to keep your positions, you will never again be allowed to treat my wife, or anyone else in this hospital, with the same indifference and cruelty you've shown her. Dr. Abbott opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer another weak defense, but Samuel silenced him with a sharp look. I'm not interested in your excuses, Dr. Abbott. You've had your chance to show who you are, and you've shown me enough. Now, you'll have to answer for it. The room fell into a heavy silence again, as Samuel let his words sink in. He had made his position clear. There would be no leniency, no second chances for those who had failed so spectacularly to do their duty. He knew that some of them might fight the consequences, try to defend their actions, but Samuel was prepared for that. He would make sure they faced the full weight of their negligence and cruelty. One of the younger doctors, a woman who had remained quiet throughout the meeting, suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling. "Dr. Jameson, I'm sorry. I wasn't involved directly, but I saw what was happening. I should have said something. I should have stepped in." Samuel's eyes softened slightly as he regarded her. She was young, likely still early in her career, and the guilt in her voice was genuine. She hadn't actively participated in Camille's mistreatment, but she hadn't done anything to stop it either. "It's not enough to be a bystander," Samuel said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You saw the way my wife was treated, and you chose to remain silent. That's something you'll have to live with. If you want to continue working here, you'll need to do better. You'll need to speak up when you see something wrong." The doctor nodded, her face pale, but there was a glimmer of determination in her eyes. Samuel hoped she would learn from this, that she would grow into the kind of doctor who would never allow such an injustice to happen again. Samuel turned back to the rest of the room. "I expect full cooperation during the investigation. Any attempt to cover up what happened will only make things worse for you." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The doctors and nurses before him looked defeated, their faces pale and their eyes cast down. Samuel felt a grim sense of satisfaction. They deserved to feel this way. They had caused his wife unimaginable pain, and now they would have to face the consequences of their actions. Samuel took a step back from the table, straightening his suit jacket. "You're dismissed," he said coldly, and without another word, he turned and left the room. As he walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the sterile walls, Samuel's thoughts turned back to Camille. He had taken the first step in holding these people accountable, but there was still more to do. He wouldn't rest until he knew for certain that the hospital had been cleansed of this toxic behavior. Camille deserved nothing less. Camille's breathing was shallow, her body trembling from the strain of hours of labor and pain. But now, with Samuel by her side, things felt different. The cold indifference and cruelty of the hospital staff that had marked the earlier part of her ordeal seemed to have faded. The weight of her husband's authority hung in the air, and though her body ached and her energy was depleted, there was finally a sense of relief. Relief that she was no longer fighting this battle alone. Samuel stood by her bedside, holding her hand firmly, his eyes never leaving hers. His presence was calming, his strength reassuring. "I'm here, Camille," he whispered, leaning close so that only she could hear him. "I won't let anyone hurt you again. I'm going to make sure everything is handled the way it should have been from the beginning." Camille nodded weakly, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. I just want this to be over. I want to hold our baby." Her voice was faint, but Samuel squeezed her hand gently. "You will, soon, I promise." At that moment, the door opened, and a new team of medical professionals entered the room, their faces serious but focused. Samuel had called them in himself, trusted doctors and nurses who would give Camille the care and respect she deserved. None of them had been involved in the earlier mistreatment, and their demeanor was a stark contrast to what Camille had experienced before. These were people who took their job seriously, people who saw Camille not just as a patient, but as a person. The lead doctor, Dr. Williams, a calm and composed man with years of experience in obstetrics, approached the bedside. His eyes met Samuel's briefly before turning his attention to Camille. His expression softened with empathy as he took in the sight of her exhaustion and pain. "Mrs. Jameson, I'm Dr. Williams. I'll be taking care of you now," he said gently. "I understand you've had a rough time, but we're going to make sure everything goes smoothly from here on out." Camille nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. It was the first time since she'd arrived at the hospital that a doctor had spoken to her with any real compassion. It was a stark reminder of what she had been deprived of for hours, and the emotions welled up inside her, threatening to overwhelm her. Samuel leaned down, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You're in good hands now," he murmured softly. Dr. Williams wasted no time getting to work. He checked the monitors, examined her progress, and then turned to his team, giving quiet, efficient orders. The room hummed with activity, but this time it was the kind of purposeful, focused energy that should have been there from the start. Nurses moved about, adjusting IVs and preparing equipment, while Dr. Williams explained each step of the process to Camille in calm, measured tones. "You're doing well, Mrs. Jameson," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. "It won't be long now." Camille nodded, her breathing ragged as another contraction hit her, but she could sense the difference. The pain was still there, sharp and unrelenting, but now there was something else, a feeling of control, of being taken care of. The sense of abandonment and neglect had lifted, replaced by a quiet confidence that things would finally be handled with care. Samuel remained at her side through it all, never letting go of her hand. He spoke to her in soft, encouraging tones, his presence an anchor in the storm of pain. He glanced at the team of doctors and nurses occasionally, ensuring that every one of them was doing their job, but his focus was on Camille. She was his world, and he wasn't going to let anything or anyone harm her again. As the hours ticked by, Camille's labor progressed. Her body ached, and her mind was clouded with exhaustion, but the new medical team worked diligently to make sure she was comfortable and safe. They monitored her closely, adjusting medications as needed, and offered her words of encouragement at every step. The trust between Camille and the staff had been restored, and it made all the difference. Every nurse who came into the room treated her with kindness, with the empathy she had been denied for so long. And every time she looked into Samuel's eyes, she saw the unwavering determination that had brought her through this nightmare. Finally, as the pain reached its peak and Camille felt her body giving everything it had left, Dr. Williams gave the words she had been waiting for. "It's time, Mrs. Jameson," he said, his voice calm and steady. "You're ready to deliver your baby." Camille's heart raced, her body trembling from the effort, but she nodded. Her hands gripped the sides of the bed as the medical team prepared for the final stage of labor. Her body was exhausted, but her spirit surged with a newfound strength. This was the moment she had been fighting for, the moment she would meet her child. Samuel leaned down, his voice close to her ear. "You've got this," he whispered, his hand stroking her hair. "I'm right here. We're going to meet our baby soon." Camille's breath hitched, and she closed her eyes, focusing all her energy on what was coming next. The contractions were stronger now, her body pushing with a force she could barely control. She gritted her teeth, her muscles straining as she gave everything she had. "Push, Mrs. Jameson," Dr. Williams instructed gently. "You're doing great." Camille's body responded, her mind singularly focused on one goal, bringing her child into the world. The room was filled with the sounds of encouragement from the nurses, the steady rhythm of the medical machines, and the calming voice of Dr. Williams guiding her through the process. Samuel held her hand tighter, his heart racing as he watched Camille's face, her determination radiating through the exhaustion and pain. She was the strongest person he had ever known, and at that moment, he had never been more in awe of her. Time seemed to blur as Camille gave one final push, her body shaken with the effort. And then, suddenly, the room was filled with the sound of a baby's first cry. Tears streamed down Camille's face as she gasped for breath, her body collapsing against the bed in exhaustion. But her heart swelled with joy and relief as she heard that tiny, perfect sound. She had done it. Despite everything, she had brought her baby into the world. The nurse carefully placed the baby on Camille's chest, and for the first time, she looked down at the tiny, beautiful face of her newborn child. Her heart soared, and the pain and suffering of the last few hours faded into the background. "Look at her, Samuel," Camille whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "She's perfect." Samuel's eyes filled with tears as he looked down at his daughter, his heart overflowing with love and pride. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to Camille's forehead before softly brushing his daughter's tiny hand with his finger. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "just like her mother." Camille smiled through her tears, her body weak but her spirit stronger than ever. She had survived the cruelty, the neglect, and the pain. And now, in her arms, she held the reason she had fought so hard. As she cradled her newborn daughter, Camille glanced up at Samuel, her eyes filled with gratitude and love. He had been her protector, her rock, when everything around her had fallen apart. Together, they had overcome this nightmare. But even as the warmth of the moment surrounded them, Camille knew that there were still battles to fight. Samuel had taken the first steps in holding the hospital staff accountable, but there was more work to be done. They couldn't allow what had happened to her to happen to anyone else. For now, though, as she held her baby close, Camille allowed herself to rest. She had earned it. They both had. A week had passed since Camille had given birth, and though her body still ached from the ordeal, she was healing both physically and emotionally. She cradled her newborn daughter, watching her sleep peacefully in her arms. The quiet of their home was a stark contrast to the chaos she had endured in the hospital. But her mind couldn't rest. The memories of the cruelty, the callous disregard for her well-being, and the racism that had pervaded her treatment still weighed heavily on her. Samuel entered the room, his presence calm and reassuring as always. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then gently placed a hand on their daughter's tiny head. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly, his voice filled with love and concern. Camille smiled faintly, but there was a seriousness in her eyes. "I'm better," she said, though her tone was thoughtful. "But I can't stop thinking about everything that happened. I keep wondering how many other women have gone through the same thing and didn't have anyone to fight for them." Samuel's expression hardened. He had been thinking the same thing. What happened to Camille wasn't just about one woman. It was about a broken system, a culture of neglect and discrimination that had been allowed to thrive unchecked in the very hospital he owned. He wasn't going to let that continue. Not now. Not ever. "I've already started taking steps to make sure it never happens again," Samuel said, his voice firm. "There's going to be a full investigation into the staff responsible for what you went through. Some of them have already been suspended, but that's just the beginning." Camille looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "What are we going to do?" Samuel sighed, running a hand through his hair as he sat down beside her. "I've been talking to the administration. We're implementing mandatory cultural sensitivity training for everyone, from the doctors down to the janitorial staff. It's going to be extensive, and it's going to be ongoing. No one will work in this hospital without understanding what it means to treat every patient with respect, regardless of their race or background. Camille nodded, her heart swelling with pride and relief. It was a start. She had seen firsthand the devastating impact that unchecked racism could have in a place like a hospital, where lives were at stake, where compassion and care should come above all else. But she knew this was only the beginning of the fight. "And the ones who treated me like I didn't matter?" Camille asked quietly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "The ones who made me feel like I was less than human?" "They're being dealt with," Samuel assured her, his jaw tightening. "There's no place for people like that in our hospital. We've already begun the termination process for those who were involved in your care. They'll never work here again." Camille exhaled slowly, a weight lifting from her chest. She had spent hours, days, trapped in a system that had dehumanized her, reduced her to an object of contempt simply because of the color of her skin. Knowing that the people responsible were finally being held accountable brought a sense of closure, but not complete peace. "There's still so much more to do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "So many other women could be going through the same thing." Samuel took her hand in his thumb gently brushing over her knuckles. "We're going to do more than just fix the hospital," he said softly. "I've been thinking, we need to go beyond that. I want to set up a foundation. A place where women, especially women of color, can go for help when they face discrimination in healthcare. A place where they'll have people fighting for them, making sure their voices are heard." Camille's heart skipped a beat at his words. It was the perfect next step. The trauma she had endured couldn't be undone, but they could use her experience to make sure that no one else ever had to suffer the same way. "I want to be involved," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I want to make sure that no one else goes through what I went through. I want to tell my story." Samuel nodded, his eyes filled with pride and admiration. "We'll do it together," he promised. "We'll make this hospital a place where people feel safe, where they know they'll be treated with respect, and we'll make sure that every woman who walks through these doors knows that she matters." Over the next few weeks, changes began to take shape. The hospital staff underwent rigorous training, with new policies put in place to ensure that every patient, regardless of race, would receive equal treatment. The administration worked closely with Samuel and Camille, implementing reforms that would hold the staff accountable for their actions. Word spread quickly through the community, and soon people from all over the city began to take notice. Patients who had once felt overlooked and mistreated came forward with their own stories, many of which mirrored Camille's. It became clear that her experience was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger problem. With each story that surfaced, Camille's resolve grew stronger. She and Samuel worked tirelessly to establish the foundation, using their resources and influence to create a support system for those who had been victimized by medical discrimination. It wasn't just about correcting the wrongs in their hospital. It was about creating systemic change, pushing for reforms on a broader scale. Camille spoke at public forums, shared her story in interviews, and advocated for healthcare reform. Her voice became a beacon for those who had been silenced, a rallying cry for justice and equality in a system that had long failed women of color. The foundation grew quickly, its reach extending far beyond the walls of the hospital. Women from across the country reached out, sharing their experiences and seeking help. and with each new story, Camille felt a sense of purpose, a sense that what had once been a nightmare had now become a catalyst for change. As the months went by, the hospital became a symbol of transformation. The staff who had mistreated Camille were gone, replaced by professionals who understood the gravity of their responsibilities. The hospital's reputation, once tarnished by negligence and racism, was slowly being restored. One evening, as Camille sat in the nursery with her daughter cradled in her arms, she smiled softly to herself. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still so many battles to be fought, so many lives to protect. But as she looked down at her child, she knew they had already made a difference. She had fought through pain, fear, and cruelty, and emerged on the other side stronger than ever. Samuel entered the room, watching Camille from the doorway with a tender smile on his face. "Thinking about everything we've been through?" he asked, his voice quiet and filled with admiration. Camille nodded, glancing up at him. "I still can't believe how far we've come," she said softly. "It feels like a lifetime ago that I was lying in that hospital bed, wondering if anyone would help me." Samuel walked over to her, kneeling beside her chair and gently stroking their daughter's cheek. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he whispered, "and because of you, so many others will never have to go through what you did." Camille smiled through the tears that had formed in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you." They sat together in the quiet of the nursery, their daughter sleeping peacefully in Camille's arms, and for the first time in a long time, Camille felt at peace. The fight for justice and equality would continue, but for now she could rest, knowing that the changes they had made would echo for years to come. And no woman would ever walk into their hospital again, feeling like she didn't matter. Will anyone finally come to her aid? Watch until the end to find out what happens in this gripping story. Don't forget to subscribe for more impactful stories and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.